clinician, neurolinguist, speech-language pathologist, and also basic and clinical research. Did her doctoral work at Brown, right, 1975, in linguistics. Her list of achievements is extensive, and she's the co-author of numerous scholarly articles and book chapters, and she's also a co-author of a book called The Foundation of Voice Studies. There's a copy right here. And today she will walk us through some of these foundations for voice identity recognition, particularly familiar voices. In her talk in the beginning was the familiar voice. So thank you, Diana.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Is the mic on? Can you hear me? Everybody's in the back, so I'll talk real loud. Thank you for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to be here, to come to Johns Hopkins, see your beautiful campus, and start meeting people and talking with people with all kinds of perspectives, somewhat different from the ones that we have in the book, of course, but it was explained to me on the way over.
So that microphone, the lapel mic, is just for recording?
I see. Oh, okay. So it was explained to me on the walk over here through the beautiful campus that you enjoy having people come with very different perspectives. So that was a great thing to know. We have brought what we call our favors, our book favors up here. Some representative objects for the book, and please help yourselves and take them home to your friends and family. This is our gift from Jody Kryman, my co-author, and myself. I became rather self-indulgent in thinking about the role of sound in the world. I've always been interested in sound and speech and music. It's been a passionate interest of mine. And a lot of times I've experienced a certain amount of chagrin, you might say, at the attention paid to visual phenomena, neglecting the wonders of sound. So I'm going to review some of those things today. And I'm going to point out that the voice is object of interest and study in historical and contemporary perspectives. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And starting by saying that studies of hearing and sound are really latecomers and second cousins in cultural history. Stephen Jay Gould, in his recent book, The Fox and the Hedgehog, says primates are visual animals. Now, after reading, in another book I'm reading called Baboon Metaphysics, after reading that and seeing how much they pay attention to the vocalizations going on in their troupe, which can be up to 500 members, I wonder if that's really entirely true. But that's what Stephen Jay Gould said. So we've been faced with cave paintings, cave paintings, cave paintings. The visual experiences going back as far as people can do any kind of history. Its visual phenomena have been widely objectified in art. The human preoccupation with the visual arts can hardly be exaggerated. So here we have a recent finding in Argentina. It was very exciting for everybody. So we have vision, vision, vision everywhere. More cave paintings, Altamira. And I wondered about the one on the top. Is that a drum? Actually, that was identified as a drum. It looks to me more like some kind of weapon. But it was identified as a drum by the people who understand these cave paintings. And I wondered, those humans down there, are they vocalizing emotions and attitudes? Because emotions and attitudes constitute part, of course, of what we recognize or think we're perceiving in the voice signal. So sound was really at a great disadvantage because without a permanent representation, vocalization could not be examined in the same way that visual experience could. There was a lot of attention to sound. It mainly revolved around music. And imagine my surprise and excitement when I discovered 30,000-year-old flutes were found in a cave in southern Germany. So they weren't only doing cave paintings, they were sitting around playing the flute. And you might be able to, this is here, this is my husband John, sitting in front of the Geisenklosterle cave, which is in a little town that tourists don't go to, Blaubeuren in southern Germany. And all of these flutes are in Tübingen, but they have facsimiles in their museum. And let's see if we can hear one of them. Geisem Klosterle Flöte. So, for those of you who love early music, this is really early music. So historically then, sound is music, and there's no end to representation of music in the heavens and in the world. A huge bunch of interest grew up around this, tremendous proliferation of musical instruments. Hurdy-gurdies are good because you can control them. Hand cranks and external power, so there's a little bit of control there with the sound. Gregorian notation was evolved, but there's really no evidence that Gregorian notation imitated the cadences of speech. There's really no interest in carryover here. So what kind of notational material are we going to have for sounds and speech and voice and intonation? It's very difficult to this day to have a notational system. So humans began to communicate with symbols. Cuneiform, I'm sure you're all familiar with. Mainly they presented the symbols of language, so specific words and concepts. Some of them did represent the sounds of language. For example, this very old 1700 BC, the Code of Hammurabi. We have an example here of talking depicted in texts early on. And if we look here, is this element depicting an intonation contour? I wondered. It kind of goes up and down, a little bit like an intonation contour, talking to Mary. Visual reproduction has a very, very long history, starting with the 5th century BC in China. The camera obscura was developed over the years and looked something like this. And in the early 1800s, the first ability to make a record of a visual scene on a pewter plate was presented as it shows here. So photography was very popular and emerged in the 1800s, functional in the mid-1800s. The first attempt there may have been others, but the first elaborate one, which you can see in the Munich Museum, to do speech synthesis using a wooden apparatus was von Kempelen, who wrote a very, very fine book about voice. Very sensitive about voice and all the various things that voice can communicate, along with his machine that he developed. But of course, the first time we could reproduce sound was Edison's discovery in 1877, which was made a little more useful in 1899. So, vision, speech, and music have had their day. The voice, for many reasons, despite its importance, has really enjoyed less attention. And here's a rare depiction of vocalization itself in the Louvre Museum. Whispering. And yet, and the main point I'll be wanting to make today, which will jump off the first title of the talk, which is in the beginning was the familiar voice. A main point is that vocalization has played a major role in biological evolution, appearing with the advent of frogs, most likely, long before speech, way long before speech. In this, you might not be able to read this. It says, if Mom catches us out here, we're really going to get it. So when the first land reptiles appeared, they were probably vocalizing, because they do now. And this ability to vocalize was a very powerful factor, according to experts in evolution, in assisting survival and social development. Interestingly for me, because of my love for the voice, vocalization appeared, apparently, according to estimates, about the same time as flowers. So I could wax poetic about that, but I won't.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
So wouldn't you assume that even before
further in the sea, could be even before. Thank you very much. I like that. The earlier the better, you know, that's the way we see it. Absolutely, yes.
So when I saw that slide of flowers, I thought you were going to tell us about vocalizing flowers.
Yeah.
Are there any? I thought there's carnivorous plants.
See, there's so many questions that arise out of this. The voice is the most fascinating topic. We just have two now. Did prehistoric fish vocalize, and do flowers make any noise? Great. Let's look into it. Thank you for the questions. Voice quality, I don't want to misrepresent the history of voice quality. It was represented, has been described impressionistically, especially for rhetorical purposes. So in a way we could call this applied voice studies, because the teachers of voice wanted to help their students enhance their persuasive skills and such. And these were the names of the teachers of voice. There were 3 different types. They did 3 different things. Some of the more salient, well-known people are Julius Pollux. We have a little bit about him in the book. He had some rating scales for voices, and the Romans were active. And then in the 18th century, there was a lot of interest in trying to describe voice in the people here. I also mentioned Van Kempelen and his speaking machine. And then in the United States, we had James Rush, who in 1859 published a very beautiful book on voice. And it's voice, its nature and use, and what we hear in it, what we do with it, how important and valuable it is. An important contribution in this whole process was Manuel Garcia, who invented the laryngeal mirror, which meant that the vocal folds themselves could be visualized if you had a really sunny day and could stand by the window. And nonetheless, through all of this, attention to familiar voices is very sparse. I know of no mention of the prodigious skill that humans have, animals too now we know, non-human animals, of recognizing familiar voices. I would love to see it. It does happen in the literature. So here in the Bible, Jacob went to his father Isaac, and the father said the voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And he went with what it felt like. He decided voice schmoice, you know, we're not going to go with that. But here it is represented. He did think about it, so we're happy about that. There's, I'm sure, more than one instance in Shakespeare. I've tracked down 2. One is when King Lear is on the heath, and he's raging on the heath. He's very mad at his daughters. And Gloucester comes along, who has most sadly been blinded. And Gloucester hears King Lear talking, and he says, I know that voice. And I like his expression down here. He says, the trick of that voice. In other words, the particular idiosyncratic nature, that's how I would translate that. The particular unique nature of that voice is what I would say he means by trick. And there's another example in Comedy of Errors, and this is where Aegeon is extremely depressed that his son does not recognize his voice. And he says, not know my voice! Oh, and that's very upsetting to him. And this, by the way, has been shown. A very nice paper by Manuel Shegloff some years ago did a study of recognizing familiar voices of friends over the telephone. And it is expected, when a friend calls someone, it is expected that the friend's voice will be recognized. And if it isn't, there's a little tension. You didn't, what? What do you mean you don't? It's what the sociolinguists call trouble. Trouble happens when the voice is not, of 2 friends, is not recognized quickly. So we have an expectation our voice will be recognized under circumstances between friends, and here Aegeon was extremely depressed that his son didn't recognize his voice. In modern linguistics, speech sounds traditionally received much, much more attention than voice. In fact, as we were talking about in our roundtable discussion earlier, speech perception routinely removed any contribution of voice, say different voices in the speech samples, varying voices, unusual voices. They removed all of that because they felt it was noise with respect to the speech perceptual process itself. And the view is very different now, as we were talking about. People in Pizzoni's lab and other places are seeing that speech perception is tied up with voice perception. That familiarity with the voice, or many talkers presenting speech information, has a very quantifiable effect on speech perception. And in neuropsychology, I'll be showing you some evidence later, voice studies have only very recently begun to catch up with faces. And they've recently begun to catch up with faces because of functional imaging. Now, people doing functional imaging are interested in bringing in topics where they can have stimuli and look at the activation performance of the activation data in the brain, and so they've looked at some voices. But until then, there was very, very little. The face work was really dominating in neuropsychology. Prosopagnosia was a well-recognized disability in the 19th century. Prosopos means face, agnosia means failure to recognize the meaning. So prosopagnosia is a face recognition deficit, and usually it pertained to familiar faces. And this is one of the times when familiarity really had an actual scientific place. The concept of personal familiarity has a status in these studies of agnosia. The word phonagnosia did not exist, nor did the disability it denotes, until it was introduced in 1982. And it's very eerie to read some of the neuropsychological literature and have the neurologist say, well, she had trouble recognizing faces, she was going to have to recognize her husband by his voice. As though that's some kind of fundamental thing that you do in your liver or something. Not sensing that that itself is a companion neuropsychological competence that can also be afflicted by brain damage. So now I come to part 2 of the talk. That was the complaining that not enough attention had been paid to voice, and now it's really different. Voices have become an object of study for a number of reasons, and it's a very exciting time for us. The interests have shifted in phonetics, for example, and in linguistics, from what they're saying, the content, to who they are and how they are saying it. What information is carried in the voice, and how do we recognize familiar, unique identities in the voice? And I show these jokes. You can see this one here. He's saying, "No, Charles, I don't have a cold. What you hear in my voice is contempt." And I show these because, to me, if a joke like this appears in the New Yorker, what that means is the cartoonist knows that people gather information from the voice, and the cartoonist believes that everybody reading his cartoon knows that people gather information in the voice. Now, that might sound very trivial, but to me it's kind of a form of a survey. Do people really know that we hear personal information in the voice? The jokes tend to suggest it. There's another one here that actually happened. See this? Oops. This actually happened. It says, "And now a correction." So this is a newscaster here, and the fellows are watching television, and the newscaster is saying, "And now a correction. Portions of last night's story on diving mules, which were read with an air of ironic detachment, should actually have been presented with earnest concern." Now, what this is a correction not of the content, not of the linguistic message, but of the tone in which it was said. Because there were complaints from the animal protection people that this was wrong to talk about this kind of activity and this kind of dismissive tone, and they complained so strongly that the following night there was, this is a newspaper article, the following night there was a retraction of the tone in which we presented the story.
Did they represent it in a concerned voice?
I hope they said it in a concerned voice. Yes, maybe trying to keep a straight face, right? Yeah, right. I'm sorry, I have nothing against mules, or I'm not for diving mules, okay? I make that clear. Okay, so what I'm going to say from here forth, henceforth, is a couple of things about how voices are everywhere, and the information contained in voices, conveyed. It's a very, very large list. It's deeper and darker than anything that we can really grasp at this time. The auditory acoustic cues that signal this information, that give us a perception of it, is also a very large list. I'm going to talk about how voices are like faces in many meaningful ways, which is very useful and nice, because then we can do analogs to the face research to find out more about voices. I'm going to talk about this tension between features and patterns, and I'm going to try to unpack conceptually a little bit how features and patterns relate in voice processing. I'm going to talk about underlying brain processes to some extent. And overall, we're going to be communicating the notion of the preeminence of familiar voices. And this preeminence is in our everyday lives and also in evolution. So the evolutionary development is focused on the voice recognition process, the familiar voice recognition process. And in our own everyday lives, this is obviously a focus of our voice perception. Okay, at least since the earliest reptiles and or the earliest fish, certainly. They're everywhere, and it follows, since voices are in so many places, that it's a topic appropriate to many academic and scientific disciplines. Many, many. People are now interested in studying voice as an object of attention in its own right, and there's many studies everywhere, acoustics, physiology, and how listeners extract the information. So here's an overview of some of the disciplines, and when we started collecting this list, we were really astounded at how many academic venues can interest themselves and do interest themselves in voice. So you can see these: linguistics, forensics, evolution, animal work, computer science, right? Signal processing, biology, anthropology, cultural differences. Then we looked at medicine, and infant voice recognition has become a very viable field now, with clear evidence that the fetus recognizes its mother's voice when compared to other maternal voices already in the fetus. Voice changes with aging are important. Now the brain function has gotten extremely lively and vivid, what with now all the various ways of doing functional imaging. And there's certain kind of voice disorders associated with different neurological diseases. Otolaryngology is obviously preoccupied with voice disorders. I mention here surgery because in transgendered persons who have had a sex change, say from male to female, there are surgical interventions in the larynx right now to change the pitch and features of the larynx so that they will sound more female, because the hormones do not affect the pitch of the voice. Media and advertising and entertainment. The attractive voice has gotten to be a major concept. What is the persuasive voice? Then in voiceovers and dubbing, huge industry. In Germany, all the movies are dubbed into German. All American movies come dubbed into German, really without exception. So now if you have somebody like Columbo, who's dubbed over and over and over, there's very serious questions to be asked. Should we sound like Columbo, exactly like his voice? Or should we sound like the character Columbo? What when we get our next voice dubber? Should we sound like the other dubber? Or should we sound, so you see this is an industry in its own right. I hardly need mention singing and vocal coaching, and there's quite a lot of work now in the various branches of psychology, including neuropsychology, on voice, certainly compared to 10 years ago. Psycholinguistics has interest in this. Sociolinguistics is very interested in this because we imitate, we try to sound like the groups that we really want to be identified with, and this can be kind of an unconscious kind of thing. There's even some suggestion that older people sound older because they want to sound older. They want to sound like their other peer older people. It's not a physiological change so much as a mapping on to what the sociological expectations are. There's quite a large industry in stereotype voice. We have stereotypes which may or may not match the way people, say, in a certain group should sound. So that's of tremendous interest. Speech-language pathology is very interested in this. So with all of these things going on in a fragmented way across so many disparate disciplines in voice, Jody and I wanted to bring a lot of the information, a lot of far-flung research together into the one book. And so we published the Foundations of Voice Studies, which came out last May. And we worked on it for 11 years. And during that time, we really did see the field grow into a viable field. So it's very exciting the book came out at a good time. I'm going to say a few words about how voices are like faces, because I think it's instructive, and because there is quite a lot of work in many fields on face recognition. It was very useful for us when we were starting to work on voices to use that as analogous study design, say, and analogous questions. And so this is, Dennis has it a little bit mixed up here. He's not sure, he doesn't get it. Guess who? And he's dressed like a clown. So he thinks that Mr. Wilson will, I'm sure you get it. The whole thing. I have shown these jokes to my class once, and one person will raise, I'll show you the one where he raised his hand and said he didn't get it. So to kind of assuage my frustration over the less attention to sound, over a couple of years I did surveys of Medline research to see how many papers were dedicated to either voices or faces, and you can see here that always there's twice to 3 times to 4 times as many papers on faces. But in 1996 it just exploded because that was the decade of face research. And pretty much everybody in neuropsychology was doing some kind of face research at that time. Very little on voice though. And then if we look at another way of breaking this down, we can see that the faces up here, over half of them, are neuropsychology. In other words, how faces are processed in the brain. Whereas in that same time period, half of them are automatic machine recognition. So the human contribution to this was really very minimally researched. If we look at a later time, the relationship has changed even more, with more than 3/4 of the work on voices from up to the year 2006 being on automatic machine recognition, which reflects the tremendous growth in technology and ability to look at these things, the demands from the corporate demands for security and for speech synthesis and all the voice trees and all these things. That's exactly what you're doing, so I don't need to say any more about that. But all the time here, in all of this, there's almost nothing on familiar voices. A few scattered papers, really nothing. So what do they have in common? Well, they're both complex patterns. So when we recognize a face, we're not sure exactly what we're using on that face to recognize it. And the whole conversation we had at our roundtable was this role of features. And we're suggesting that features play a variable role in familiar face and voice recognition, that some are important for some patterns, others are important for other patterns, and that's what we mean by variable role. They both occur in discrimination and recognition modes, which means I can discriminate two unfamiliar faces or voices, or I can recognize a familiar face or voice. That means that they also come in both personally relevant, we use this word PERL to refer to personal relevance, and personally relevant or unfamiliar exemplars. They can both be posed or spontaneous. And neuropsychologically, there's a very big difference between a posed smile and a spontaneous smile. Brain damage will affect one but not the other. And with voices, we have the notion of the posed or disguised voice, as compared to the spontaneous voice. So they're subject to disguise, both of them. They're keys to personal identity, surely. And we're seeing more and more how very crucially important they've been in phylogeny and ontogeny. Yes?
Can I ask a quick
Yeah,
question?
please, real loud so I can hear you.
So there is this people that can really recognize faces of people, even show a little young person, baby person, and they can recognize a person today, you know. I mean, they can go back, you know. They have this super ability of prosopagnosis, you know. Is there an analogous thing for boys? Super phonognosis?
They can or they can't?
They can.
They can.
Yes, there was actually, so much like you have the problem of not recognize the face, you have the people, they have this uncanny ability to recognize a person today from a picture, you know, I mean, like 20, 30 years ago. And I wonder whether there is the opposite of prosopagnosis.
I don't know. I think that's a wonderful question. The relationship of recognizability of faces and voices has come up a number of times. Anecdotally, we think that the face is more subject to age changes than the voice,
I see.
because we've experienced encountering somebody on the street and they start talking to us and we say, oh, I didn't recognize you, you've changed, I recognized you when I heard your voice. But as far as babies, because the males have a voice change, but that's the kind of thing that would be very interesting to look at. And I find it very interesting to look at these prodigies, people who can do things extremely well.
Exactly.
That tells us a lot about what the brain could do if we'd leave it alone, probably. Yes?
I would imagine that blind people might have enhanced ability in this because they're not relying on visual cues at all, so they might be better tuned to this.
This has been studied, whether their auditory perception is more acute in discriminating and stuff, and most of the studies suggest no. One would think that.
Even for speaker recognition?
That, nobody has done that I know of, no. And certainly not for familiar speaker recognition, no. But for other auditory material, there's not really an advantage that's been seen, but these are all things that haven't been studied yet. That's why it's great to have people here who want to go out and study things. Any other questions, comments? Okay, so they maintain their format through time and effects of aging. We just mentioned that. My impression is the voice maintains it better than the face, but that's just an impression. And hemispheric specialization can be studied using both of these things. There's a huge amount of work on hemispheric specialization. Faces, and although that ear, when that exploded, all that face work, it was really all hemispheric specialization. It was lesion studies, split visual field, where you look at one visual field or the other, and make all sorts of judgments. Now functional brain imaging has really gotten into the mix. Both can have either flat to animated expression. That's another thing faces and voices have in common. They figure very importantly in personal relationships. Records can be made. There's great forensic interest here, a lot of forensic work on this. And both influence speech perception, because now there's a view in speech perception that the movement of the lips contributes very much to our success in speech perception. And now, as I said, the role of the individual voice in speech perception has also become of interest to a lot of phoneticians and speech perception experts. There is obvious difference in the temporal versus the spatial domain. And in the work we've done with familiar voices, and a couple other people, Schweinberger in Magdeburg, Germany, also has found this. The familiar voice, and in this case it's usually the famous voice. The famous voice is recognized in under 3 seconds, or it's not recognized. That is the amount that is needed to make the recognition. It can be recognized a lot faster. Only voices are accessible to the fetus, and it turns out the mother's face is not reliably recognizable until about 6 months. So that's really quite a big difference. I think of voice as part of a structured prosodic system, which to me makes it very different from faces. Now I'm going to go through this, and then I'm going to tell you when I gave this talk a couple weeks ago what somebody said that would temper this comment. we have now vocal information is carried through fundamental frequency, intensity, voice quality, and various temporal measures. So let's talk about that as the prosodic material that's being carried in the signal. And what kind of information does that cue? Well, all this information. In a tone language, pitch and duration are major cues to these phonemic contrasts. So it's a very linguistic job that prosody, if we want to think of it as prosody in this context, does in a tone language. In English, we have import and import, and we have noun, verb. Import is the noun, import is the verb, convict is the noun, convict is the verb. We have verb, it's not a huge repertory, but we do have it's productive. I've heard people use a new word with using this correct rule contrast. It's very, very present in Norwegian and Swedish, and Japanese. They have a huge amount. We have some. So this is word level prosody. Sentence grammar means we tell statements from questions by question goes up, statement goes down. And then there's a lot of what we call discourse and non-literal functions of prosody, which we won't talk too much about. Attitudinal meaning is communicated. Am I bored? Am I enthusiastic? Am I cooperative? Am I stressed? These, of course, shade into psychiatric things and to emotional meanings, and it's really hard to know where to draw the line. And then we have vocal identity. So this is a structured view of the information that prosody conveys in the speech signal. And we can't really think of it as layered. It's much more interwoven. It's hard to know where one begins and the other one ends. And what I was saying when I gave this talk at the phonetics lab at UCLA a couple of weeks ago, and I said that this differentiates voice from face, this structure here. And somebody in the room said, yes, but not when you're doing sign language. Because there's linguistic parts of the face, and this grammar does this, and this does that, and that is structured in some way. So I don't know enough sign language to be able to say that, but I would mention that. So the way prosody is used in language, in speech, I mean, falls on a continuum from discrete and permutable, more, with tonemes being completely discrete, so a language has 5 of them, period. There's not 4.5 or 4.3, it has 5. These word level stresses is either a noun or a verb. It's not going to be nouny or anything in between. So these are discrete. And down here we have much less ability because most of these meanings down here are graded. So we're faced with graded meanings. We're faced that I can sound more angry by raising my voice higher. I can sound more uncooperative by saying, I'd really rather not do that. I'd really rather not do that. I'd really rather not do that. So I can be incrementally uncooperative in a graded kind of a way. And that right away hurls analyzing this into a whole new domain of complexity. Any comments about that? Yes, thank you.
Is there a discussion of this in your book?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, very good.
All of this is in chapter 8, and all of this is in chapter 9. Yes, okay.
I was actually wondering why you put voice identity on the lower end of the spectrum.
Because, thank you for that question, because if we're talking about voices as individual patterns, as we were talking here, there's no concept of permutability there. Each one is unique. So I can't think of this voice as kind of sequentially related to that voice or anything. They're unique. And so in terms of any kind of combinatorial notion that we have a little bit up here, or rule-governed aspects, none. So it goes down at the bottom.
So but in that notion you don't see, even though each voice is uniquely identified, you don't see that as a sort of continuum in another space where some voices are more confusable with each other than others, in that sense.
This has not been researched. last time I was at, did everybody hear that? The question is, can voices, even familiar voices, right? Can familiar voices themselves be thought of as some continuum where some are more confusable than others and some are more attractive than others or whatever? Sure, definitely. But that isn't really quite the same as import and import, when we have a rule governed situation and we can really define how these units are going to come out. I was out visiting my co-author Jody Kryman in Los Angeles last couple of months ago, or I don't know, a month ago, and we spent 4 hours discussing the continuum from unfamiliar to familiar. So we have unfamiliar on this end, which you'll see at the end of the talk, and we have familiar voices on this end, and our question was, is there anything in the middle? Can we talk about a kind of familiar voice? And I was going to try to be ecumenical and open and scientific, and I was going to say, well, maybe there is. And Jody said she doesn't think so. She thinks there's a set of familiar voices and everything else is unfamiliar. So, and the set, and I'll get to that a little bit more because I have kind of a heuristic little graph that kind of shows that. And what we have been finding is that, certainly it's been found over and over, the tonemes of a tone language are processed in the left hemisphere of tone speakers. That has been shown in a half a dozen ways with more speakers, more languages. We have been proposing that voice identity is in the right hemisphere. So hemispheric specialization also patterns along this continuum of more linguistic, less linguistic. Because the left hemisphere is better at analytic, sequential kinds of things, the right hemisphere is better at overall pattern recognition kinds of things, and it turns out that the long configurations of an emotional utterance, like an angry 6-word utterance, say, will probably be better recognized in the right hemisphere for a couple of reasons. One of them is complex pitch is better recognized in the right hemisphere, discovered by my very husband over here in 1980. And secondly, because the overall pattern, the configuration of the emotional utterance will be better recognized in the right hemisphere, and also because the right hemisphere is better at emotional experiencing. So now we have really converging reasons why this fits better in the toward the right hemisphere processing. Yeah?
So I think of prosody, which I guess is what you call sentence accent here, as...
No, prosody is all of this. Sentence accent is one unique type of prosody. Like if I say I gave John the book.
I mean intonation contour, I'm sorry.
Intonation contour, yeah.
Yeah. So I think of that as having both discrete and continuous elements. So you could do Toby annotation, which is entirely discrete, but you could also say that you have a degree of intensity, like how extreme are your pitch targets, and how quickly you move from one to another, and things like that. How much of the accent centered on a particular word. And I'm wondering how much is known about the hemispheric processing. Is it
you can do a Toby phonetic representation. This is true. Even the Toby people say that the representations are pretty much unique for each sentence. In other words, they're describing a configuration. They're not describing some subset of units that are themselves discrete. So I wouldn't quite go along with the notion that a Toby representation is representing anything discrete.
Well, I don't know. So there's, I mean, you listen to Mary Beckman pronounce a bunch of different contours, and there's a difference between a statement contour and a low-rise question and a high-rise question and incredulity and things like that.
Right.
And
those
are language specific.
That belongs up here.
Yeah. Okay.
And those do tend to have this discrete quality that you're talking about. Yes. Yes. In fact, this is really an excellent point. Thank you for bringing it up. One of the efforts of the people trying to describe, the phoneticians and linguists trying to describe prosody in speech, one of their efforts has been to find tunes, to find individual tunes that signal some kind of information which is independent of the content, the linguistic content. And the classic of that is na, 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 na. That's the example that's given. Everybody knows anything I say on that tune is going to have that meaning. If I say, John's not sitting up. So it sounds critical. I would never, never, but it sounds critical because that's the meaning of that tune. And that's exactly right. That is what people studying prosody are trying to do. They're trying to isolate the subset of things that are just as reliable as the rising intonation of a question and a falling intonation of a statement, that have these prosodic meanings that then they can start understanding how we do these things. That's right, I would call that discrete. Not because Toby, not because of Toby, but because they are able to see these patterns, yes.
Okay. So is there a hemispheric split in the processing of the
well, you've got two things going on here. What I didn't put on here is that length is important, so the longer something is, the more likely it'll be right hemisphere. And so when you have these longish things here, nobody's ever really been able to find left or right with the sentence grammar stuff because you really need longer sentences, and that throws it over to the right hemisphere. So that is kind of a problem. But I mean, theoretically, according to this, it should be processed more in the left hemisphere, yes. Great comments, yes.
So would you disagree with this statement with regard to, from the point of view of the result, voice identity can be the result, voice identity can result from almost anything in prosody or voice quality or pronunciation in a given individual,
right,
and to any degree. Right?
I agree with that.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to say that in about 3 minutes. That very thing. Thank you for... Okay. Oh, this is the joke. This says, so it's a very large and variegated list of information that's conveyed. And this is the joke that when I was teaching a class using a book for the first time, called Voices and Listeners, and a student in the front row raised his hand and said, what does that mean about a little more hair? What do you say? I mean, what do you say? Now, the very funny thing, can everybody see this, what this says here? The very funny thing about it is this. Female listeners do report some male voices as being more likely to be associated with having chest hair. So our producer wasn't so far off as we thought in the joke. Okay, here are some of the judgments that people make from voice. So, a huge array of physical characteristics, I point on both sides. Many, many psychological characteristics. This is a very small, selected list. Many social characteristics. And so on. And this, again, is evidence that people know this. They know that it's important to have a certain tone. Miss Harrington wished the staff good morning for me and put some feeling into it. And jokes show this awareness in the popular mind. And here is a partial list of vocal characteristics that contribute to voice perception. And this follows up on the question that I just got. That all of these much more measurable parameters communicate or signal all of these characteristics I just mentioned. Now we get to ones that are a little less standard and their role is a little less clear, like glottal attack, breathy voice, harmonics to noise ratio. We can measure these things, but we're a little less sure of just what are they contributing to this information. And then we have a very big range of temporal characteristics. We can measure them, but you can only measure so many things, and you want to pick which ones to measure, and it does turn out that people who talk fast are considered to be more competent. People that talk slow are considered, so that's one thing that's signaled, one vocal characteristic that signals a personality characteristic. But there's so many, and it's very challenging to decide what to measure to find out what information is being signaled. One of the ones I really like is syllable structure. There's a change now with we call them the Valley Girls, or the girls in People magazine, or wherever they are. They say information. They don't say information. information. So there's a change now in the syllable structure that is signaling a group, a certain group of young girls who all like the same things. So these are important clues to all of these sociolinguistic, personal, and psychological qualities, information that we hear in the voice. So now what we have is a many-to-many relationship, many speaker characteristics, and many vocal cues. So now we move to the problem of familiarity, familiar voice. Voices have a signature indexical pattern. It's unique. It belongs to one person. There's no meaningful way to think about somebody's voice being kind of graded other than your question of can we rate them and rank them? Well, we can rate anything, right? We could array anything, any visual, auditory, anything. But if we think about the unique voice of somebody, it's not particularly meaningful to think about how it fits on some kind of scale along with other familiar voices. So they're unique, they belong to one person, and as I've said a couple of times, historically, very little scientific information has been paid to personally familiar. The word is a problem. Familiar is very often used to mean frequently exposed to. So yeah, I'm familiar with Earl Grey tea. What if we limit it to mean personally familiar? You look in the literature, and personally familiar is used for both generic and unique entities. For example, I can see in the literature, we're going to do a study to see whether she did better with recognizing her keys than somebody else's keys. So the personally familiar keys, it's still generic. It's not familiar in the sense of the unique identified person who's your daughter or your girlfriend. How different are these in mental representation? I think we have to assume they're pretty different, and that we want to clarify it at least as we're approaching these questions to be clear about which is which. I also already said something about the agnosias, and in the 19th century there's a lot of work on this, a lot of it in Germany. They had two types of agnosia. They called it apperceptive, where the individual details of something weren't very clear, couldn't be perceived, and the other was associative. That's the failure to know its meaning. So for object agnosia, that would mean, for example, somebody could look at this glass and they could say, well, it has these angles and it's round at the bottom and round at the top, but I don't, and describe it perceptually perfectly, but I don't know what you do with that. I don't know what it is. In other words, its meaning was lost. There was a lot about prosopagnosia. They called it face blindness. And there's, by the way, a couple of websites now where you can log in if you think you have developmental face blindness. You've noticed you don't recognize people's faces. And so there was a little bit about sound agnosias, but not too much. So what we've done with this, to unpack some of this terminology, is that we have contrasted perception with identification and discrimination versus recognition. And we say that unfamiliar voices can be discriminated, but familiar voices are recognized. And in any kind of task where we do any kind of work with unfamiliar voices, there's going to be a greater role of featural detection, because the two voices are going to be analyzed, they're going to be listened to, they're going to be matched for what seem to be the important signature features. I should use signature because I always use that with familiar. On the other hand, in recognizing familiar voices, what we say is there's a greater pattern of this gestalt closure where the whole thing is recognized without particular attention to the individual features. And we call this the fox and the hedgehog model, because the fox knows lots of little things, that's the features. The hedgehog knows one big thing, that's the gestalt. And that's why we have foxes and hedgehogs on our papers. How do we come up with this? Early in, when we were doing this work in the 80s, we had famous voices. You can see some of them here. We played them forwards and backwards. And we found that forward and backward presentation severely impaired the recognizability of some voices and not at all others. So you can see David Frost, who has a British accent, he was highly impaired backwards, if I can say it that way. And Lawrence Welk, he has an accent too, foreign accent, you could say. Billy Graham has a southern accent. So these people were very poorly, below chance, recognized backwards. On the other hand, some of these people here, you probably don't know Everett Dirksen. He had a very, very distinctive voice. I think it was a voice pathology. I think he needed voice therapy. But he was recognized as well backwards as forwards because that particular voice quality information was not affected by backwards presentation.
And this task was a multiple choice or just...
Oh, they always had 6 possible answers, and we played the voice, and then the 6 possible answers were always in the same set. So they would be all comedians or all, because their style. We didn't want them to pick it off by style. They would be all politicians or all movie stars. Yes, this is multiple choice, and was I believe this was with 6. So so when they're getting down in the 20s, they're getting close to chance. Then we also expanded and compressed by the speech samples. We had an apparatus. This was long before we could do this digitally. We had an apparatus that put little tiny chunks all the way through the speech, expanding it without changing the pitch. Or it took little tiny chunks out, compressing it without changing the pitch. And you really couldn't hear the difference. It just sounded faster or slower. And when we looked at the names, the voices that were affected by these alterations, again, we noticed a very different effect of the different acoustic alteration. So this means they were severely non-recognizable under that condition, and you can see how differently they were affected. And this was how we started to get the idea that different auditory acoustic cues are important for the recognizability of different voices. That there's a huge set, as was just mentioned, there's a huge array of possible auditory acoustic cues, everything from fundamental frequency to syllable shape, to pronunciation, to vowel formants, everything in there. Yeah?
To your knowledge, have any of these old experiments been rerun with machine out with today's speaker recognition algorithm?
Oh, what a good idea. No, there's been really very little.
Backwards speech should affect them some, but maybe not to the same degree that it
That's right. What a great idea. Yeah. No, I know of nothing like that. Yeah, that would help to separate out what cues are important forwards and what ones are being obliterated backwards. And yeah, if it could be mapped onto the performance, that'd be great. Yeah, great idea.
You think the audio exists for these?
The audio exists. These were our studies. Yeah.
So you still have the audio?
Some basement somewhere. I'm sure we could find it. Yeah. This was done. A similar thing was done more recently by Robert Ramez, who is at Teachers College, a psychologist and a speech scientist. He took, as I mentioned earlier, these are the people in the Haskins labs. So they all knew each other's voices. And he altered all their voices by this sine wave change that he does. Some of you may know this. And then this figure here, everything in black is chance, and everything above black is better than chance, significantly better than chance. And so here you can see that a little more than half of the voices were not recognizable as sine wave representations. But some were really very well recognized that way. So now we have a different acoustic alteration that has affected voices differentially. And so when we think about what is, this is kind of jumping from the acoustics now, but when we think about how are we going to represent a familiar voice, what do we think is going on in the mind, a familiar voice? And with some introspection, a little bit of impressionistic introspection, we can see that there is quite a large constellation of characteristics. Now, some of this has been shown in the neuropsychological literature for other things, like people's personal biographies, for faces. This has not been directly demonstrated. We've not really done a study on this. But I think most people can agree that for a familiar voice they know, say their wife or their friend, that there is rather a flood of personal associations about how they look, how they walk, what their interests are, a little bit about the history. There's a valence. It might be a positive or negative valence, say, a person that we don't get along with, there'll be a negative valence. So there's a lot of a range of associations that include movement, emotion, visual, declarative memory, what we know about them, the episodic that we know about them, procedural memory, the feeling we've had in a conversation of interacting with them. So this has led us to the notion that it takes a whole brain to recognize a voice, because so much of the brain is involved in recognizing the voice. On the other hand, if we wanted to do an analogous schematic representation, rendition of associations to an unfamiliar voice, this would be about it. It's just, if it's over the phone, is the person tall or a little idiosyncratic, sounds tense? No, we might make a few judgments, but it's much sparser in comparison to that pattern gestalt that we have stored for a familiar voice. And we propose this hypothetically as something that can be tested in research, because it's obviously of interest to think that these voices are stored and processed in such different ways. And this is the schema that I was thinking I was going to mention in response to your comment about, can't we line up these familiar voices and sort of rank them? Yes, I'm sure we can, because we can do these psychological experiments really on anything, and some very interesting things would come out of that in terms of how they're related, how we think of them. But I put this together a while ago to represent the work that we had done in the 80s, which suggested that features are not additive, they're not equal in importance, there's not a unique set for all voices. They comprise a very large set, and they're made up of different levels or groupings. So we saw there's acoustic, there's ones that have to do with the speech pronunciation itself. And that therefore we're going to conclude that the perceptual processes differ for familiar and unfamiliar voices in significant ways. So that if we think about what we have in our mental representation, or our perceptual space is the term that the psychologists used to use, familiar voices might look a little bit like this, where their relationship to one another is not so clear. They have a unique identity, they're separate, whereas the unfamiliar voices that are going around behind us might look a little bit more like this, because it's going to be male, or they're going to be younger age, or they're going to have a foreign accent or not a foreign accent. And so there'll be a few things that will kind of, in here, we'll kind of associate. But here, there's a different kind of thing going on. And that's really one of the points that we try to make in the book. The familiar voice set is more heterogeneous.
So,
Yes.
I know you mentioned this earlier, but I'm still curious about this definition.
Curious about?
The definition. How do you distinguish familiar and unfamiliar? I mean, how many exposures do you need before
Right.
an unfamiliar voice becomes familiar? And then likewise, does it depend on what kind of exposure they are? For example, if I only hear someone on the telephone in a business setting,
Right.
does that still count as familiar voice?
Okay, the comment was, how am I distinguishing between familiar and unfamiliar? How does something become familiar? How can we say that it's familiar? What is the operational definition of that? Well, that, of course, is a $64,000 question. And in thinking about this and reading literature that was related to this, we came up with the idea that uploading a familiar voice into the repertory that I just showed is much more like one-trial learning, or imprinting, or flashbulb memory, which are types of memory which are relatively instantaneous. So in other words, there's no learning curve on them. Exposure is not the point. The point is that there is a personal relevance, a limbic association. There's a certain process in the brain that knows how to upload those things right away. And it's different from the kinds of things we do in the lab, where we expose somebody to a voice for 2 weeks, and at the end we say, okay, you recognize. It's very different from that. Now, as I told you, Jody and I had this big argument. We discussed for 4 hours, is there this discrete set of familiar voices and everything's unfamiliar? Well, it's intuitively kind of annoying, right? Because surely there's some kind of time where you have this learning thing, where you're getting acquainted with the familiar voice. So I don't quite know how to answer that, but I think it's really a little bit more in the direction that they are two disjunctive sets. And one of the ways familiar voices get to be in this place is because there is a unique mechanism we have that has a whole brain engagement, which includes memory, emotion, arousal is important, cingulate gyrus, amygdala, all these things kick in. And one of the writers say there's a print now command. I love that. Print now command. Get it in there. And that's a different process from other things we do where we slowly are exposed until we learn something. Yes?
Yes. Again, I want to try out this statement as a summary. It seems to me you're saying that between ecological significance and exposure, ecological significance is the more predominant factor.
Thank you.
Surely exposure counts,
Sure.
but you can't duplicate ecological significance with more and more exposure.
Very nicely, beautifully rendered. Yes.
So I have another question on familiar versus unfamiliar, if it's not too early. Whether there's any difference in the resistance to things like masking or greater persistence in memory or something like that that can be measured by an engineer.
I'm sure there is. We talked about that in the round table. We talked about the fact that with all this work in faces, when the faces were blurred, you know, when the signal was made blurrier, people did better. The right hemisphere did better. So what would happen if we introduced noise into familiar voices? Nobody's done this. Almost nothing has been done on familiar voices. Everything that's been done we reviewed in there. And this is such an open field now to try to understand how we do this.
Well, let's let Dinah finish since we're running close to
Okay,
time.
I'll just whip through here. I'm almost done. Okay, so everybody here is familiar with top-down and bottom-up concepts, so we would bring that notion into making the difference between familiar and unfamiliar, where bottom-up is much more the process in recognizing the unfamiliar voice, so looking at the features, comparing them, whereas top-down, where the pattern is first and then the features can be looked at. This is a study I was talking about earlier. Here, this just came out here in Cognition. And in this study, there were these representations of somebody walking, the inverted representation of that, and a non-organized set of dots. And the colors in these dots were changing at different rates. And the subjects looked at two of these, any two, different twos were all matched in different ways. And they were asked to push arrows to indicate what the rate of the color change was. And in all cases, their judgments for the upright walking thing were different and less than their judgments of the rate of change of the other two things. And these authors actually, so the dot colors change continuously at different rates. Subjects adjusted rate of change in one figure until it matched a comparison. Color change in upright stimulus was perceived as less than inverted. So, and they actually say that the Gestalt visual recognition mechanism is able to recognize the pattern, and it does so at the expense of details. It says that. It says in that paper, I have it written here somewhere but I can't find it. It says that it does that, it almost is tantamount to saying it represses the details. It won't do the details. Like, we don't do windows. The Gestalt thing does not do details. That's what they said. And they talked about this as a process in vision, which is, well, they didn't say innate, but that's what they meant. I'm going to finish up now. I know my time is, how much time do I have?
Well, technically, we're getting close to the time, so.
Yeah, okay, I wanted to talk about the brain damage studies. We had unfamiliar recognition where the people had two stimuli. It was something like, would you be willing to answer a few questions? Would you be willing to answer a few questions? And they had to say where they said by two different people or the same person. Then we had the recognition task, and we gave them pictures, photos, names, and spoken names, because we didn't want their response mode to be a problem. And we found normal controls were about the same on doing the recognition and discrimination task. Left brain damaged people, we got damage in the left hemisphere, can't talk, can't understand language half the time, just as good at normals in these tasks. But the right brain damaged people were significantly reduced in the recognition task. So that's where we came up first with these ideas here. And this has been supported in the last, since 2000 by some of the people doing functional imaging. We also then are claiming that discrimination and recognition are unordered and independent. And that kind of speaks to the question over here on this side. When does it become familiar? We found people that were at chance at discriminating, but they were at normal levels in recognizing the voices. So now they can't perceive the differences in these unfamiliar voices, but they can recognize the familiar voices, which really made it look like that these are really very independent processes. This is the end. This is the model that we put together. So we have a continuum here which can be used to express whether all this information about voices that I just said. When the familiarity is low, the heterogeneity is going to be low, and it'll be more likely processed in the left hemisphere. In contrast, when they're high, it'll be more in the right. We have feature analysis and pattern recognition here, and there's also now this cortical-subcortical axis where the declarative and episodic information that we have about voices is cortical, and the procedural emotional information that we have is subcortical, and that can come into the mix too. We do say that it takes a whole brain to recognize familiar voices, and this figures in the book, so you can look at that. We give all the reasons why we think all these parts of the brain are active in recognizing the voice. And we say now as early as the appearance of frogs. This is, I guess I won't have time to play this, but this is 600,000 king penguins. And this is the wonderful David Attenborough sitting with them. And there's 50,000 chicks and this huge amount of noise. He has to scream to talk above all this noise. And the chicks and the parents find each other by their voice. So this is the preeminence of voices in evolution. That's why we say in the beginning. We used to say that we know a lot more voices than the animals, but I'm starting to wonder about the baboons because they recognize so many. I'm just reading that now. A fossil was found recently, this unidentified skull from China, and so now there's a lot of discussion about that. And we can ask, do these early hominid types, did they have vocalization, speech, language? We really don't know. It's very, very controversial when speech and language came in. But they all recognize familiar voices. We can be sure of that. So, patterns and features interplay in distinctive ways. Familiar and unfamiliar voices undergo different kinds of processing. They engage different cerebral systems. They predominate in everyday life. And some of these claims can be tested by thoughtful experimental design. That's it.